Says Katherine Tate began her professional career at age 18 after landing 3 civilian contracts with the Department of Defense, taking her on an extended tours to Asia, Europe, and South America. Her international experience continued in Christian missions in Europe, South America, and Africa. It was her experiences working abroad that deepened her appreciation for America and for the uniquely American religious and political liberties that we enjoy. Her faith and patriotism have motivated her to serve others for over 2 decades of professional and volunteer community service as an educator and administrator in Mississippi and a successful industry representative in Dallas, Texas. Katherine earned her bachelor's or BA from Mississippi State University School of Art, Architecture and Design, and a master's in Education, Leadership, and Policy from the University of Texas. Through her award-winning work as an art teacher and administrator, she was selected to serve on Mississippi's first arts education supervisor and was invited to attend the prestigious Teachers Institute of Columbia University in New York. And it sounds like you're a lifelong student. A lifelong student, she was accepted into the PhD at Regent University and has completed 3 summer residencies and 36 hours in doctoral level research, focusing on America's educational heritage and evolution of public education policy. With over 2 decades of professional experience, Katherine has taken her message of the faith of the founders to the constituents of Mississippi's 3rd Congressional Districts. Let me introduce you, Katherine Bitsy Tate. Come on up.
Thank you, Don, and thank you all so much for having me. Let me have my notes here. There's so much I want to say, and yet I don't want to take up too much time. I want to give you plenty of time for questions. When I was thinking of running for office, there was a scripture that came out to me and just stuck with me. And it was from the Psalms. It was after David had slain Goliath. And he said, "You, O Lord, have strengthened me and prepared me for battle. You have made my arms strong to bend the bow of iron. It is you, O Lord, who have made me great through your gentleness." And that last one just stuck with me. And then I thought, you know, David had spent hours and hours and hours and weeks and weeks and weeks and months and years taking care of sheep, and yet he gave God the credit for preparing him for battle. And I wouldn't run for office if I didn't think I were prepared for battle. It is war, what you've just heard. When I was teaching, I retired from teaching just to take a year off to finish my PhD. And then this opening came up and I thought, let me just try to go run for office. But when I was teaching, 16 years in the classroom, I saw the evolution of humanist secularism in the classroom, just absolutely ruining education. And it's a war. It's a war. And somebody has to be prepared to fight. And I think I'm prepared to fight. And my doctoral professor, now this has taken me years to come to this conclusion. I was a strong advocate for public education. I would tell my friends, I said, well, I forgive you for abandoning public education. I'm a 3rd-generation public school educator. You know, they were sending their children to private schools and Christian schools. I said, we've got to have a strong public education system. But my doctoral professor slowly but surely showed me that the government really has no right in public education. I didn't really know that. So for the past 3 years, I have been researching what was the original mission of public education. Well, of course, our founders wanted to train up godly, virtuous citizens capable of self-government. But that was the only reason for a common school or a public school, and it was not to be controlled by the government, merely supported in the communities. And anyway, these are wonderful books. I just wanted to tell you about them. Is Public Education Necessary by Blumenfeld. And the one that my doctoral advisor wrote, William Cox Jr. Dr. Cox is a very devout Christian, a brilliant scholar, and he wrote Tyranny Through Public Education. And it's just absolutely changed my whole view on things, and it's kind of given me a purpose. Whether it will be writing or running for office or serving in office, but the message has got to get out that our government has become tyrannical. Now, I started out with the scripture about David, and I thought, what is going to be the rock that slays this tyrannical education? You know, David just had one rock. And I think it's legitimacy. I think our government has gotten so illegitimate in its trying to replace God, really, in educating children, in taking over families, and that role that the government has absolutely no place. So I think that's going to be the rock that slays our government. I wanted to just tell you, since I am in my research, when I have an opportunity to speak, I may read something that the colonists wrote or the founders wrote. And let me just tell you this, all of their writings are like sermons. That's another thing I had heard just in school, that our founders were deists. Well, that is not true. They were absolutely committed, devout Christians, for the most part. Like 99% of our colonial leaders, certainly, and by the time 100 years later they founded our nation, they were devout Christians still. Tolerant of other religions, and when they said religions, they meant Christian denominations. Most of them were Calvinists, actually, and Reformed, and it is that Reformed faith that gave them the courage to stand up against a tyrannical government. They believed in individual accountability. In fact, they were the most quoted, I'm sure you know, the most quoted source in all of their writings was what? The Bible. What book in the Bible? I just learned this in my research. Well, Deuteronomy in their official writings. Deuteronomy, because that is where all of the laws were laid out. But the second most quoted source was Montesquieu. And Baron de Montesquieu wrote Spirit of the Laws. And as they were thinking about establishing an entire new nation, they looked, of course, to the Bible first and foremost. And they looked to Montesquieu. He's the second most quoted source in their political writings. And I just thought I'd give you just a little bit about what Montesquieu said. Montesquieu, if you don't remember from school, you probably do, but he's the one that developed very bravely, because it was going against the monarchies at the time, the theory of a three-branch government, a separation of powers. And this was just unheard of. He was brave to put forth this theory, and it was based on the triune God. Montesquieu was a believer. He was a faithful, godly man, and he sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but had the thought, if I were giving you a Sunday school assignment and you had to create the perfect government for Christians, what would it be? And it was the Republic. He divided political systems into three basic categories. The Republic, which is amenable to the Christian religion, and he said it's the type of government that, for sinners, to keep other sinners from sinning, he understood the fallen nature of man, a republic, but it has to be a separation of powers so that no power will be concentrated. And then the monarchy, of course, where you are motivated by just serving the king, and the monarchy went on for 1,000 years with virtually very little change, just serving the king, and where your class was in life, there it was. And then Islam, which is based on fear. So, he developed this idea of the separation of powers that could be used for a Christian-based government in a republic. where the people are sovereign, but under God. Now, this is something in my research that I'd love to just throw it out to you, because this is really the first time I've presented it. I'm still researching it. It's just an idea that I have. But if our founders were so Christian and devout in their faith, which you can tell by their personal letters and other writings that they were, and they were developing a government, why did they not name the name of Jesus in the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution? Well, this came to me, and like I say, I'm just going to throw it out to you all. It's because they understood, as their forefathers, their Puritan forefathers had understood, and who fought for religious freedom, that the name of Jesus is the name of that individual accountability between every individual and his God. The name of Jesus. It's a personal name. And it was not appropriate for a political document, because the government carries the power of the sword. And that name cannot be coerced or forced. Hence, freedom of religion. So it was just so brilliant. And thank you for indulging me on that. The other thing I just want to tell you a little bit about me, but really, Don just said it all. I have a background in education and corporate life. I've worked my way through both degrees, undergraduate and graduate, and I'm working now, except I was able to take a year off because I have so many years. Was able to take a little retirement, but I want to get back to work as soon as possible. From Tupelo, Mississippi, my parents were very, very active politically and in the community and service, and they were true community organizers, just volunteering, starting the community theater, starting the Tupelo Symphony. I just saw my parents with their friends give of themselves not only to us children, and I was adopted actually by my stepfather, so I'm an only child, but adopted into a wonderful family with lots of step-siblings. But I saw them give me the example of giving back to the community and working in the community, and that's just what I do. That's what I know. So I've always worked 2 or 3 jobs and volunteered and gone to school, and I'm so thankful to have this opportunity to take a little break, maybe finish my studies, and actually maybe run for office. And I will tell you this, I would love to have the support of the Tea Party. I have not been very politically active. I didn't even know much about, and Elva was telling me about this petition. I did sign the petition to get Chris on the ballot. I think it's kind of a little discombobulated the way this election has come up, but we really need conservative people in office. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Will you say your name again?
Yes, I'm Katherine Tate, and my nickname is Bitsy, from my middle name Bitzer, which was a family name.
Catherine,
Yes.
you obviously have followed some study that is strongly endorsed by Mark Levin.
Oh, yes. We're trashing the Constitution. I love Mark Levin. I love Mark Levin. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
You took off just from what I was about to say, but the reality is public education has been contorted so that we will not learn those basic principles about our founding and how it was a moral path they were pursuing. They didn't want to establish a religion, but they wanted to encourage in every way possible for each and every individual to follow their own faith path.
Yes.
You want to talk about that a little more? Maybe in the context that Mark Levin brings it? Because I'm sure you probably know about that.
I love Mark Levin, and I would like to get his most recent book. Personal accountability is absolutely necessary for a republic. And beyond that, what is necessary, and Montesquieu also, and all of the writers that influenced our founders, the Calvinists, the Reformers, personal accountability in the virtue, but it has to be a voluntary virtue out of thankfulness and a belief that God is good and that God is loving And that idea permeates society, and it's what's called a common grace. It influences the society for good. And it allows those people who are not quite sure about their faith to come to faith without being coerced by a government. No, the government wanted there to be freedom of religion, and as I said, in their context, it was a freedom of denomination. They saw persecution of Baptists, persecution of Catholics, and they did not want that at all. They wanted this to be a Judeo-Christian nation based on the God of the Bible, and they saw their role as a calling. And when I see what is happening in our schools, and it's really made me physically ill for the years that I've been in school, and people say, I don't know how you lasted that long. Well, when I first taught in the 80s, it wasn't quite as bad. And I love teaching, and I love working in the public schools with the children who are not necessarily the rich kids, the kids that have advantages and things. I love that. But then when I went off and did other things, I came back. All I can say is, when I saw what was being pushed as American history, it wasn't American history, it was current events, it was propaganda. The history didn't even start until 1835, and it was all the bad things that America had done. And I just made it my mission to correct that thinking and ask my students to go to primary sources, read for yourself, find out for yourself. You know, the nation was not an evil, imperialist, white supremacist. It was not that at all. In fact, our founders, you have to do a little bit more digging into the 1800s. If you look at the minutes of the meetings of Baptist meetings, Presbyterian synods, etc., the slave issue in the South, they knew that it was their duty to educate slaves, servants, and slaves in the Christian religion to prepare them for emancipation. And the federal government forced the issue, and we can look back and say, well, that's fine, but they knew that we were all created equal, everybody was, and it was a good beginning, and it's just gotten all askew. And our education system has done more damage than I can even say, as well as the court systems, but that's a whole other issue.
Catherine, well, you hit the nail on the head when it comes to education. I've been homeschooling now for 3 years, and I remember when they've heard the story about the algebra problem that came to my house that I did, and my son told me I was doing it wrong. And of course, when he started drawing boxes and numbers and circling, it took him 3.5 minutes to do an algebra problem. It should take 30 seconds. I knew we had an issue.
Oh, sure.
I fought the principal, fought all the way to the superintendent of schools, had a meeting with him. Neither one of them could do that same algebra problem that I'm talking to you about because they hadn't been trained in Common Core. So a lot of us have seen this coming on strong the last few years. We've had Dr. Duke Pester down here. We've had Dr. Stotsky came down, where she had the #1 curriculum in the state of Massachusetts in English. Neither one of them would sign off on Common Core. And Common Core is basically designed by a non-educator from either Yale, Princeton, or one of the Ivy League schools there. And he actually admitted in a meeting to Senator Stotsky that the current math did not make him college ready. So he laughed it off like, this is a big waste of time and I'm a big fool and y'all bought into it type attitude. What would you do as a legislator once you get to D.C.? I know that Trump has talked about it. Betsy DuVos I'm a little bit questionable about because she had back Common Core at one time in her career and now is starting to do some changes. I don't know if they're legitimate changes or not. What would be your plans or what would you do to change the curriculum schools? That question along with, it's not up to the federal government to educate our kids in the first place, so that's not probably a bad question. It's up to the state and local. What would you do to get the federal government out of our schools?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, and specifically as a congresswoman, I'm not sure what I could do, but I will tell you I was very disappointed in Betsy DeVos. I thought when she went to Washington she would systematically deconstruct the Federal Bureau, and it appears as though she has been sort of sucked into that system and compromised. Now, she's trying very hard to implement a system of choice. What I would promote in any way possible is legislation that would call to attention. It's like the rock I said that David had. Those bureaucracies are illegitimate. So legislation that would defund the Public Education Bureau and go to a total universal education savings account for communities and states, and eventually deconstruct even at the state level. The education of children is the responsibility of parents, period.
Could you actually defund the Department of Education? And just totally take their funding away where they go?
Totally. They have absolutely no business, unless it were a strictly informational role, an infrastructure type dissemination of information, sort of best practices, but no authoritarian role at all. And I'll give you an example. It just broke my heart. It just was the last straw. I think it was 2014 when I was teaching. We would get, and every year there would be something new from the Department of Education, which was really the same thing regurgitated with the different names, but basing itself on we are the federal government and we have authority to tell you how to teach your children, basically. During the Obama administration, something that was unprecedented happened. A guidance package was sent out, not only from Secretary Arne Duncan, the Education Secretary, who was very, very aggressive in promoting the homosexual agenda and all that kind of thing in the schools. But it went out jointly from the Department of Education under Secretary Arne Duncan and the Justice Department, signed by Eric Holder. In effect, threatening schools that if they administer discipline on minority students, that they may be investigated for civil rights violation. And they cited, what they cited was this research that said there are disparate incomes between minority students and white students. Or disparate outcomes. Well, having, praise God, the opportunity to do doctoral level research, I looked at the studies they were looking at. It's not valid research. You know, you can manipulate data and that kind of thing, but you have to know what you're doing to look at the data to see if it's valid or not. Well, it was just nothing more than just a fear tactic. And so when that came down to the states administered guidance, policies, that this has come from the Federal Department of Education and the Justice Department. We recommend that you take care, extra scrutiny, when administering discipline to minority students. When that got to the district level, the district levels would issue these new advisories about disciplining minority students. When it got to the school level, the administrator, the school principal would recommend, teachers, we want you to have all this documentation and at least 3 incidences before we're able to discipline a minority student. And then when it gets to the teacher level, it's not even worth it. So it's just, the effect was that now students are above the law and they know it. Because you're in a school with all minority students. That's not discriminatory to administer discipline. You know, it's the federal government assumes that basically we're gullible and can't take care of our business, and so it made me mad, and I thought that's it.
What you're describing there sounds like what happened. the consequence of which was the shooting that went on in Broward County.
Exactly.
And that is
Exactly.
extensively proven, and there's many articles out there in the news
Exactly.
that shows how that sheriff, Broward, I think his name is Israel, his last name is Israel, was so entwined in the Democrat Party and the idea of what that message was from Eric Holder, and down through all of the levels. That child never got disciplined. Never got the attention of anyone to try to discipline him.
And he was trying to call attention to himself, and students know that they can just do anything. Broward County had an agreement, and this is very common. They had theirs in writing, so it became public news. They had an agreement with the school. And by the way, schools under the Obama administration became virtually laws unto themselves. They would not, you couldn't call local police authorities when a student had broken the law, and I can tell you, they had an agreement. The school system and the local authorities had an agreement that they would not administer punishment to these students because it made their numbers look bad. I know the last year before I took a break from teaching, my car was stolen. Well, in the parking lot. And we have 4 security officers, one of which is a resource officer armed, and supposedly video cameras and all this kind of thing. And there was just always something happening. And the students knew that they could get away with it. Of course, the administrators did nothing, and of course the local police could do nothing because they have no authority, because the school district is the law enforcement authority. Well, to make a long story short, I knew who stole the car, and they took it to Yazoo City and they wrecked the car, and the arresting officer there just happened to get the student's information and his statement that he had gotten my keys out of my black cabinet in my office, etc., etc. Well, when I told the local authorities that, suddenly the arresting officer did not remember saying that. They did not remember saying that. Completely withdrew the statement. So after the district had gotten hold of that officer who didn't know they were supposed to protect the student, you know, students are above the law, it's really a mess. And I have personal stories that can account for that. But let me just say this. My students are absolutely, they're wonderful. It's not their fault. It's just not. It's just the system has just gotten totally indoctrinating them in wrong values.
Ms. Tate, thank you for coming. And your political philosophy I like very much, especially the Calvinism, since I'm Presbyterian and such, and I'm well familiar with that. Let's take that philosophy and put it into action. There'll be a debate coming up in a few weeks. It's going to be mainly on economics. I hope you're agreeing to go to it.
Oh, yes.
Nonetheless, we've got this omnibus bill, and now some Republicans are talking about maybe picking parts of it to pieces, which to me would be a good thing. And we don't have a taxation problem other than being taxed too much. We've got a spending problem in Washington.
Right.
And from doing away with the Department of Education, which to me is about the only recourse that is decent, you're going to have to deal with a lot, even if you're on the Education Committee, that will not exactly be what you want to deal with. It's going to be economic matters, infrastructure matters, and so on and so forth. Tell us other aspects of your platform, especially in getting the government out of my pocket.
Right. Well, I will say this on the omnibus bill. I would not have voted for that. I'm disappointed that Trump actually didn't veto that. And I'll tell you why. I happen to recall just being an educator, and I looked at the summary, and mental health programs, their mental health spending, $900 million, I believe, was exactly the same recommendations that had happened under the Bush administration. I remember because it trickled down into the schools, the same amount, or billion, $900 million was one year, $1 billion this year, or vice versa. Nevertheless, the same type of program trickling down into the schools, and it absolutely has done nothing to help. And again, it's not the government's business. Mental health is not the government's business. Education is not the government's business. Charity is not the government's business. The government has provided incentives for promiscuity, the breakdown of marriage, etc., to build a voter base, I guess, of dependents. But it's not the government's business, and I would do anything possible to vote against anything that continues that. As a congresswoman, I would just vote no, 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 no. In fact, I like what Scalia said. There should be a 5-year moratorium on any new legislation, and especially spending, unless you can balance the budget. And you can balance the budget if you take away that welfare, and that would, I know, be an initial hardship. But charity is not the business of government, it's the business of families. It's the business of families and individuals, churches.
That's right.
Sure.
Planned Parenthood / abortion. What is your take on that, and what can you do to stop the government's?
Well, I would certainly vote for ending abortion. On that, let me just say there's no law that permits abortion. There was one case that decriminalized abortion in that one instance, Roe v. Wade. And this is another thing. People think that the ruling on a case becomes law. Well, you probably don't. You know better than that. But that ruling is only binding in that case, in those circumstances, with those parties. And to say that that's true for universally throughout America is just a misapplication of justice. There's no universal application. Every state should have challenged that when they tried to implement it. Let me tell you another thing that's been my idea as I have researched. Human rights are different from political rights. I think the argument for ending abortion is not the correct one. I don't think babies have political rights. I think babies have human rights. But the mother is the one who's responsible. And I've wondered if, in the interim of between now and the time that we can end such practice, if it might be appropriate to administer consequences on those who abuse human rights. Perhaps suspend voting privileges for the mother and the father who choose to abort their child. Or suspend voting privilege for the mother and the father who chronically depend on the public to have more and more babies. I don't know, but I've just been wrestling with that and researching it, and I'm not sure that babies have political rights, or at least I'm not sure that's the argument. I think it's the mother that has the political responsibility over that child. I don't know that babies have political rights. I've even asked someone in person from Center for Law and Justice, Jay Sekulo's organization, spoke at Regent University one summer when I was there and discussed this at length. And that's debatable, but by and large, children do not have political rights. So I think that's the wrong argument. But of course, abortion is horrible. But since the government and the culture subsidize immoral behavior and licentiousness and out of wedlock, out of marriage sexual activity, then I don't know. Abortion is just the natural consequence of where our culture has been. So.
I've noticed that there have been a number of cases where the parents have been charged with child abuse when they do something to harm them. Mm-hmm. Why doesn't that apply to abortion?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. If that's not child abuse, I don't know what is. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Also, a minor without approval or permission from the parents can have an abortion.
Oh, it's just horrible.
What could you do, or what would you do to get that off the books so that minors have to have parental consent?
I would certainly join with any others who I think there's power in numbers there, and it just has to come from the will of the people to change that. And I would certainly join with any who would support reforming that and at least making it for adults, and then again taking away political privileges for those who perform that murder. And I would just have to work with others. I would absolutely support.
Would you champion a bill? Would you write a bill?
Yes, I would. And in fact, I love writing, and I did have a chance to write the legislation for the art school, so it's not like I have not had experience. So yes, I would absolutely. Absolutely. Love to author a bill like that.
What motivated you to get in this race? I'd like to know that, and then what kind of plans do you have for winning this primary?
Okay, let me just say this. You already know I felt it was a calling. It was just something in my spirit and my relationship with God that told me, now's the time, go ahead and try this. When I thought I was taking off to finish my PhD, and then this opening came up, and I talked to my dad, and my dad said, yes, it'll be a great learning experience. Just go for it. Just jump in there. And you know, as a teacher, that's all I needed to hear. It's a learning experience. And then, of course, and I believe I've been prepared for this. I told you the scripture that just came out at me. I believe I've been prepared for a battle. And it's a battle. Let's see what motivated me. Oh, and then what I would do. Well, let me tell you, the two jobs that I've had besides teaching that were rather large-scale jobs as the state arts supervisor and then also as the industry rep in Dallas, Texas with a huge account, I had no idea what would happen in that job and what would be the opportunities that would be laid before me. But I just got in there and worked every day, for example, and big things happened. In Dallas, I was hired. First of all, it was just me. It was a huge account. They needed a rep. I just took one day at a time and grew the account almost triple in the time I was there. I knew I needed a warehouse. I was a textbook representative. I found a warehouse. I hired 6 people to help me, and we just hit the road every single day. I made 2 sales calls a day, and I knew that was what was needed, and it just, God bless that. So, and the other thing with the arts position, same thing. I just took one day at a time, worked hard, and saw opportunities, and was creative. Worked with those who had similar ideas, and I don't know exactly what I could do. I would love to author a bill like that. I would love to author a bill that defunded the Department of Education, but I don't know exactly what, but there's no question in my mind that I could shake things up and I could be used to accomplish some good things.
You could hold on to your views and hold on to your values, because I don't know any woman in Congress who speaks the ideas that she does, and hardly anybody. And to me, Harper had good intentions when he went up there, but he got sucked into the career advancement thing, I think. I don't know. And he became more and more distant from the values of the people in Mississippi,
Right.
and took orders from McConnell primarily, it appeared to me.
I can tell you by the proven record I have that would not happen. First of all, I'm so much older than all the other candidates who are seeking this office. I am not ambitious, I'm just obedient. I was perfectly happy actually being at home. I'm not ambitious, I'm just obedient. And I'll also tell you this, personal accountability gives you a strength that I wouldn't trade my accountability for anything on earth. And I've had to sit You want to talk about accountability. When I was preparing for the mission field and I had to sit before Presbyterian elders and the mission board and answer questions, are you sexually pure? Are you financially responsible? I appreciate that accountability, and that's been with me ever since. My principals will tell you, they did not. Okay, let me just tell you about the little story about Elijah. You know, when Elijah was going to King Ahab because of the corruption that he saw, and Elijah didn't even want to go to the king and confront the king, but he was called to, he had to. And the king saw Elijah coming. He just rolled his eyes. Here comes a troublemaker. And Elijah said, no, you are the problem. You're the troublemaker. And I know my principals would see me coming and just roll their eyes. Here comes Miss Tate, the troublemaker. It's just something that I'm called to do, is to call attention to these things. And I love my principals, but they compromised. They felt like they couldn't stand up.
I'm a retired public school teacher.
Well, they felt like they couldn't stand up. They had too much to lose. I have nothing to lose. And I wouldn't think of doing anything other than, I'm not making a lot of promises of what I would do, but I know I wouldn't compromise.
One more question. We have a problem with immigrants that come in. What is your stance? What is your take? What would you do to make, not go away, but make it to where we can all live within?
It's horrible what has happened with our borders and the catch and release. We virtually had open borders. And yes, we are a nation of immigrants, but I'll tell you how I explained it to my children. You only need 3 things to be a country. You only need 3 things to be a country. And if you've never thought about it before, you have to have sovereignty, some sort of sovereign government, whether it's a monarchy or a republic or whatever, sovereign government. You have to have people, and you have to have defined borders. That's what makes a country. And forgive me if I said this the other night and you've heard this before, but borders were very important to God in establishing a nation. And we base our laws on the Judeo-Christian laws of the Bible. And borders are very important. Now, what I used to tell my students, you know, when we were teaching, there's a big problem in high school about students wanting to get out of class and walk the halls and go visit somebody else's classroom. They'd all want to come to Miss Tate's room because I will tell you, we had a good time in my class. We were always working, doing something fun and creative. So there were always people coming to the door. And my students, after I explained to them about sovereignty and all, they would take it upon themselves to say, Miss Tate, illegal immigrants trying to get in our classroom. So they understood. If the person had permission to come in, that's one thing. If another teacher wanted them to come sit in my classroom and do some work, that's one thing. But just to come in unannounced, without permission, no, no, no. And that's what we have to do with our country. So we have to protect our country's borders, control them.
What is your view on the Convention of States?
I don't know much about that. As I told Alva, I've not been politically involved for long at all because I was just teaching and working, except to see policies that came down in the schools that made me mad. In fact, when I was preparing for the missionary field, I had a whole year with no television, nothing, and I recommend that strongly to anyone who's not tried that. I always recommend it to my students and say, if you can't do it a year, do it 6 months, do it 3 months, go a week with no media. But anyway, on the Convention of the States, I would have to research that. I don't know what the purpose would be. I don't know what their desired outcome is. And I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards.
Go home and read on it.
I don't think we need a new constitution if that's what it is. We have, our constitution is about as perfect as you can be this side of heaven, so I don't know what the purpose of the convention would
Well,
be.
the long and short of it basically is sending delegates from each state to basically say that we had a balanced budget amendment.
Oh, balanced budget amendment,
I mean, that would-
absolutely.
What they do is they take a subject matter at a time and get together. In fact, they had a mock one here in Mississippi where Chris Brown and several others, Angela Hill, went up to D.C., went to Williamsburg, if I'm not mistaken, and had a mock convention. So basically, it's to get together and actually tell Congress, it's the only place we have to tell Congress what laws that we can put on the books without utilizing their efforts. So if we want a balanced budget amendment like we have in Mississippi, and you know how they do in Mississippi, but have one for our country, is to rein in our spending. And that's part of the Convention of States. You take a subject matter time, it could be abortion.
Okay.
Could be where they get together, we're no longer as a country going to do abortion. We're going to come up with a rule or a law, and it's done. Congress can do absolutely zero. So that's basically the gist behind the Convention of States. It's
Okay.
giving the people back their country
Oh, yeah.
and to come up with the rules that the Congress does not want to come up with.
But then the Congress would have to pass it through the regular channels?
No,
Oh,
They would not be involved.
no, it would be a constitutional amendment.
Right.
And the reality is, so much of what Congress does violates the Constitution.
It's Article 5.
Yes.
And the Constitution says in Article 5 that the states have the right to do this.
Yes.
And there's so much of what Congress has done that has not been consistent with constitutional framework,
Yes.
that they need to come up with. And right now, they're very much aware that the Convention of States is gaining a lot of traction. And the problem that they're concerned with is that they're going to have to accept some laws that they didn't make and they have to live by. And to follow that up, this week, they are proposing a balanced budget amendment. There are a number of really good conservative voter advocates who are saying, we do not want this balanced budget amendment. We haven't seen the particulars of it, but from the verbiage that they're hearing from legislators, they'll vote for a balanced budget amendment, and if they can't meet the balance, then some judge can come along and say, you have to raise taxes. So a balanced budget amendment in the hands of the Congress might be extremely dangerous. That's one of the reasons Citizens for Self-Governance have started this project, which is called the Convention of States Project.
And there's already been about 12 states that have already approved it. Mississippi did not do it this time, but we would actually send representatives, and they're held to a certain standard when they get there as far as how to vote and all this kind of stuff from the constituents. So there's a lot of control from the states versus the federal government.
Well, I would love to look at that and see what specific, what is
You
it
can actually
called,
go
action?
online. You can actually go
Okay.
online to Convention of States and actually read about it,
Okay.
learn a little bit about it. It's not difficult. It's that the states, once we get to 34 states, which would be a majority, then we could hold a Convention of States.
Mark Levin has written a book about it. It's called The Liberty Amendments, and he clearly explains all of the nuts and bolts that you might have questions about.
Definitely.
It's called The Liberty Amendments.
Okay. Sounds good.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family?
Yes. Now, on my father's side, I was adopted, but I will tell you, I come to appreciate that so much more as I grow older, that he stepped up and adopted me and wanted me to have his name and have a family. My mother and my biological father separated when I was very young. I lived with my grandmother for a little while Mother was out finding her way. You know, being a single mom back then was just real different. She was brilliant, 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 brilliant woman. And what struck me at her memorial service 3 years ago was they called her a philanthropist and, as I said, a community organizer. And I said, I didn't know. But oh, she was just awesome, awesome, awesome. And she was influenced by her political family background. We grew up under the shadow of Walt Doxey. That's my uncle, Walt Doxey State Park, and Mother was a Doxey, and was just always very interested in politics and community service. and my dad was a businessman. And I remember going around with him door to door. He supported William Winter. He also supported Goldwater, so I don't know, but, you know.
What a conversion.
I know. But he started with a little table and a telephone and a filing cabinet in the back of Tate's grocery store, which was my grandfather, his dad, Tate's grocery store. And we would go around and put business cards on doors and everything, and he turned his business, insurance business, into just the biggest one in Tupelo. Very prominent businessman, and he and my mother, as I say, were very involved in the community, and I learned so much about that. I wouldn't think of living any other way than being active in the community, trying to help any way I can, using any gifts I can to help the community, because they gave me perfect example.
Well, how about you? Do you have a family as far as kids or a husband?
I do not.
Okay.
I do not. I did have a wonderful husband, good, fine Christian man. But I was young and rebellious, and when I had biblical grounds to leave and go off and do my own thing, I did. But I tell young women, just get over it, you know, because now I would, you know, do differently, because he was a wonderful man. But anyway, no, never had children or anything.
How do you stand on the Second Amendment and as far as the right of the
Well,
right to bear arms?
Don't try to come take our guns. That is just ridiculous. I'm all for the Second Amendment. Absolutely, definitely. I mean, I think I would die for that one, because, as I say, the government has the power of the sword, and we don't want all those guns turned on the citizenry. I will say I have been, as a youngster in the music business and living that kind of life and all, I've been involved in some very rough situations, and I was shot, left for dead, have a bullet in my collarbone. And after that, I was actually robbed 2 other times at gunpoint, had a gun pointed at my head 3 times. And I really need to probably have a gun myself, but I don't. I was just traumatized after that 3rd time. I tried to buy a gun, keep it in my home, and I didn't want it in my home. But I certainly would defend everybody's right to have a gun and protect their own home. I have very large dogs to protect me in my home. So.
Ms. Tate, you mentioned adoption a moment ago, and that you were adopted. Many times those of us in the Right to Life community are accused of, oh, we'll do anything to stop the abortion and the child be born, and then we don't care afterwards. My question to you is, it's hard to adopt a child in Mississippi or in the country as a whole, simply because the government regulates it so much, to the point of telling you how you can or cannot punish that child. I'm big on adoption. My ex was adopted. And I like promoting adoption as well as promoting pro-life. And it's the best route for some girls to take. The government, of course, says abort, you can abort, and then it goes there and says, you're also going to rear this child the way we say. What would you possibly propose or look to make adoption easier? Get HHS out of it as far as I'm concerned, but should the government have any say so much in adoption? And secondly, if so, what would you do to make it easier?
Adoption should be very easy. I've actually applied to be a foster parent because I may have been one of those people that said, well, you can rail against abortion, but I worked with neglected and abused and abandoned children every single day. And I would just ask, are you willing to rear that child? Because that's fine if you want to save the birth of that child, but you're consigning them to a life being reared by the government. And I said, Uncle Sam does not make a good father. So, it should be easy to adopt. There's so many children out there that need homes, so yes, I don't know the process. Like I say, I appreciate my father adopting me, but that was as a stepfather. Adoption should be easy. And if there are true reforms that are going to happen, and young girls and women who don't want their child are going to now not have that option, then everybody's going to have to just step up and help them, until the moral fabric can be changed so that it's not even an issue. So.
Any other
Is that
questions?
it? Okay, sure.
I know that you've done a lot more research than I have. About when did the Federal Department of Education come into being?
Oh, yes. Ooh. I read the whole transcript and the Christians who were fighting so valiantly against it, and I don't know, but I do know, was it the late 1800s? I don't know. It began, and then it didn't mushroom until the 1920s. And Horace Mann and the secularists came in. So when it began benignly in the late 1800s.